Welcome back to Novelio. Today is Tuesday, August 27th, and I am continuing on with my reading of Hot Winter Sun by Jessica Russell. Robert was thoughtful on his way back to Briarwood, and unsure of how the household would react to this clandestine elopement. He predicted his twin would have much to say, but would not risk being slowed down by any family consternation. Catherine had caught and held his heart firmly, and no man on earth would change his mind or his intentions. Upon returning home, he was dismayed to see they had callers, specifically Lizette Ashington. Lizette was a young woman whose family recently acquired a neighboring estate a few minutes' walk from Briarwood, and she had firmly set her rights on Robert or Julian for a husband. She was attractive, with red hair, deep blue eyes, and a good form, but neither twin had the slightest interest in her, as she was a somewhat shallow and frivolous person. Robert knew her temper would match her hair color when she discovered he had wed, and the blacksmith's daughter at that. He couldn't help smiling as he rode into the courtyard and jumped from his horse, tossing his reins to the groom. "Good day to you, sir," Lance said as he took Robert's horse. Lance Tresham was their gamekeeper and in charge of the grounds. Lady Ashington and her brother arrived a little while ago and are in the summer parlor. "Thank you, Lance. I will make my way there now," Robert said, and his grimace was not lost on the man. In truth, there were a great many ladies seeking the hand of Robert or Julian, as the twins were something of a phenomenon to have entered their 30s without being wed. But Robert was a romantic at heart, and refused to marry where he did not love. Julian, on the other hand, was adamant about never marrying, and whenever the subject of heirs was introduced, made a point to tell his twin that particular burden was his and his alone. Robert, typical of his sunny disposition, would usually reply, "I'll keep that in mind, brother, but your perspective will change when you meet a lady who captures your heart." Julian would simply give him a withering look, but the two would ultimately laugh over the matter. Robert entered the hall and made his way to the summer parlor where Lizette and her brother Paul were enjoying tea with Jennifer and her husband, Richard, the latter of whom were the twins' sister and brother-in-law. Richard Grantley was a landowner on an estate close by, but it was several centuries older than Briarwood Manor, and structural problems made it necessary to do extensive repairs on the property, and they were settled in at the manor for a few months until the renovations were made. The twins were pleased to have them, and lively conversation was enjoyed in their company. Shortly after, Robert greeted Lizette and Paul. Julian came to the drawing-room for tea, as well as to feign pleasure at Lizette's presence, which he hardly felt. The brothers' eyes met across the room, each of them holding back laughter as they knew the reason for the ladies' frequent visits. They often needed no verbal communication to know exactly what the other thought or felt, and in this case their feelings were mutual. Robert, constantly mischievous, told Lizette that Julian had been wondering when they were going to call again. Julian shot him a warning look, and Robert smiled ever so subtly. He knew Julian would get his revenge, but still found it worth it to stir the pot with their adoring Lizette. Robert's twin did not always appreciate his brother's sense of humor, but never truly got angry. Robert sat down then, inwardly groaning, but knowing manners dictated that he spend some time with their impromptu visitors. To do anything out of the ordinary would not be wise, as he planned to steal away within hours to fetch Catherine. "Have you been on a ride, Robert?" Lizette asked unnecessarily, as he was clearly dressed for riding. "Yes," he replied, helping himself to tea. "I was at Jeremy Granthorne's farm, looking over a magnificent black stallion I think I will buy. I have other matters to attend to presently, but when those are taken care of, I think I must invest in that horse. Granthorne's asking a very reasonable price." "I don't suppose I should know what the going price for a stallion is," Lizette replied, "but I'm sure if you think it's good, you are correct." Paul was almost embarrassed at his sister's blatant flattery, and had said on more than one occasion that she was on a sleeveless errand to seek a proposal from either brother. Nevertheless, she was wilful and determined to do as she pleased, so he accompanied her frequently to Briarwood. Paul always enjoyed visiting, as there was an entertaining quality about the twins, and was privately amused at the way they seemed to know what the other was thinking. He certainly did not need to wonder what they were thinking now. "You did a fine task of making Lizette think I was interested in her company, brother," Julian said later, "and I hope you remember it when you find sugar water in your whiskey flask one day. Where were you besides Granthorne's, by the way? You smell like a lady's perfume." Robert smiled, thinking of the delicate fragrance he had bought for Catherine in Paris. It smelled of violets, and he told her it was as bewitching as she was. I was getting a new shoe for Prince from old Blake, and speaking to his daughter, whom I plan to marry." "Marrying the blacksmith's daughter, are you then?" Julian laughed. "It's not the first time you said so. Sometimes I think you're serious." "How do you know I'm not?" Robert replied, smiling, but Julian merely shook his head and laughed. He had fleeting thoughts over the past year that his brother was seriously involved with a beautiful young lady, but could not bring himself to believe he would offer her marriage. He wondered if Robert would have been angry to know that he himself had been flirting outrageously with Catherine just the day before and invited her to join him for a romantic interlude. She had replied that Julian had too high an opinion of himself, and she would rather shoe horses from morning until night than join him anywhere. He remembered being quite entertained by her quick retort, and thought it was interesting how she could turn such phrases. He wondered if she'd come into possession of some books and perhaps had learned to read. "Let me know if you finally agree on a price for the stallion," Julian said as they made their way to the main hall for supper, "and find out from Granthorne if he has a cow or two for sale. Cook says old Sadie is on her last legs. I likely won't buy the stallion till next month, but I will inquire about the cow tomorrow, as I'll be passing that way very early," he replied. Julian thought he looked downright mischievous, but could not settle on a reason why. Robert was as casual as he could manage at supper that night, considering his entire life was about to change. He told the family of what he discovered in France, primarily that many of the wealthier households were more than willing to share second homes or other properties with English noblemen who may need to exile with their king. No one wanted to think of that outcome, but the Bradshaw twins knew they must prepare for the worst. Robert was relieved when supper was over, and afterwards he exited the manor through a hall and doorway not much used and stole over the meadow under a moon that was not quite full but just on the wane. He wondered for a fleeting moment if Catherine would lose her courage to meet him, living as she had under the oppressive religious beliefs of her father and being continuously threatened with hellfire for the slightest offense. Naturally, the old man could do nothing to her once they were wed, not to mention he depended on Briarwood Manor for his living. As he slowed his horse, his concerns were swept away. She was exactly where he had told her to wait, and thought she looked angelic with her hair bound in a long, thick braid, and her enormous grey eyes shining with excitement and trepidation. They were soon locked in a long embrace, and when he stood back to look at her, he could clearly see she was committed to their plans. She told Robert how she had instructed the children to run frantically to their father as soon as it was dawn and tell him she was missing. She knew that would be far more convincing than allowing him to discover her absence on his own, and then feigning an innocence afterwards. She also told them to keep asking where she was and if she would come back, which would be the natural thing for children to do. Robert thought the plan was ingenious, but your father is another matter altogether, though. I cannot think what Lord Bradshaw will say. I'm convinced he'll be nothing less than outraged. He'll be surprised, Robert said with an almost careless air about him, but if you are thinking he would disinherit me or cast me aside, it's not true. We won't be thrust into penury, love. I care nothing for money. In any case, I've never had enough of it to matter, she said, laughingly, but you may have something else in mind for your life. Let's just say I know my father, and he loves his sons dearly, although at one time I thought he hated us because our birth ended our mother's life. Such events are so sad, Catherine mused. A woman waits so many months for the joyous arrival of her child, and then the poor woman's life ends as the younger one begins. It has always been in some cases. Someday they'll find out why and create a remedy for it. Perhaps the shock will be too much for him, though, if he's already in a weakened condition. You worry too much, sweetheart. He is not so ill that my marriage, regardless of the wife I choose, would cause his demise. He thinks you are being unduly morbid. Perhaps I am just so frightened. It cannot be undone, no matter how much it disrupts the household. I hope they will all come to accept me in time. Even as she said it, though Catherine did not believe it, she thought perhaps if she was lucky, Robert's sister and brother-in-law would eventually resign themselves to the marriage. The twins' father was another matter. How could he be pleased with such a match? And no part of her believed Julian would ever accept her. She recalled so much of him from her early years and remembered that he was always the more aggressive of the two. When she grew older and extraordinarily attractive, he made it clear he desired her. Many sons from the local manors treated the village girls as if they were there for no other purpose than to satisfy their lust, and she often felt that Julian looked at her in this very way, although he had certainly never attempted to force his intentions on her. He just flirted with her brazenly, and she felt unsettling emotions around him. This being the case, she naturally chose Robert when the attraction sprang up between herself and the twins. Not knowing of the relationship between his brother and Catherine, Julian had made more than one indelicate proposition over the last year. Catherine thought he was an outrageous person and could not imagine living under the same roof with him, but supposed she would handle it as best she could when the time came. When Robert and she had first become aware of each other in a serious way, it was as if a silent message had been exchanged. I must know you better. In the beginning, physical attraction took over every other emotion whirling within her, but as they grew closer, Catherine realized it was far more than that. Robert had a quick and intelligent mind and was delighted to find that she had been educated by the rector, thus allowing them to converse on a broad range of subjects. He had a gay, light-hearted attitude towards life, as well as a mischievous streak that she thoroughly enjoyed, and like herself also possessed excellent perception regarding others. She didn't need to speak at times for him to understand how she felt about something or predict how she'd react. As time went on, they had refused to allow the bond between them to break, regardless of their differences in background or upbringing. She supposed it had happened to thousands of couples before them. That invisible, powerful, romantic urge that cannot be argued by logic. You are very quiet, Kathy, Robert finally said. Are you changing your mind, then? I can hear your smile, Robert, and you are smiling because you know the answer. Do you know how happy it made my mother to know I was to marry you? She was happy indeed. But, Robert, if I should die young, not a bit of it. You will be stronger than ever when you can live a proper life away from that ungodly home. No more morbid talk, that is a command. He laughed, and Catherine could not help but laugh with him. Robert always refused to be pessimistic, and it was one of the things she loved most about him. Then I guess I must agree with your prediction that all will be well, she said contentedly. Entering by the ivy-covered door, he led her through an archway of ancient-looking stonework and across the flagstone court to where they would enter the manor. Catherine couldn't make much out in candlelight, but she was overwhelmed at the thought of it being her new home. I can't believe I'm here. I'm to live here now, she thought suddenly, that she would be the one being served rather than the one serving, and it was a curious thing in her mind. She almost felt as if she were the heroine in a child's storybook. She was rescued by a handsome knight or some magical hero from a life of turmoil and brought to a palace. But would her new family want to turn her right back out? Life was not a fairy tale after all. Cease to fret now and come into my arms, Robert whispered as they reached his room. This day has been too much for you, and I will not have you a fainting bride on the morrow. I shall be too excited to faint, she replied. Her condition sometimes resulted in deep fatigue and a fluttering of her heart that could feel somewhat alarming. Nevertheless, she lived through her days much like a normal young lady, and once she was his wife, he would be watchful if he thought she was too far exerted. Shall I tell you who noticed you first when you became a young woman? It was Julian. I was speaking to one of the workers at Granite Lee Estates, and suddenly my brother said, Could that be Catherine Trefellner over there? That the adorable child grown into an exceptionally beautiful woman right under our noses? And indeed it was you, suddenly an adult, 16 at least, and the loveliest woman in England. I remember being there with my father that day. I was just to the side of the courtyard when your brother came riding up. It was when Jennifer was ill. sitting in the garden trying to get warm in the sun, and everyone was horrified because she'd left her bed. That's my Catherine. She remembers every detail of life from the moment she was born. In fact, Julian saw me in the stables later where my father and I were tending the alien horse. I believe he had plans to seduce me from that moment on. And now? He will be in a rage that I have run off and married you right under his nose. He thinks everything is due him first because he made his appearance in this world a few minutes ahead of you. He may never forgive you. You two have always shared everything. He's more apt to be outraged because has forever lost his chance to have you for himself, and sharing only goes so far, even between twins. At this, Catherine could not hold back her laughter. At dawn they departed for Falmouth to be married by the village vicar. Along the way, Robert remarked about her beautifully cut riding habit. It was deep blue, and she wore a grey hat with a blue curling feather on it. I was going to snatch one of Carrie's, although it may have been a bit short, and worry about it later, he said, referring to his young relative, Corinsa Barrington, who was also a member of the household. She had come to them 7 years prior at the age of 14, when her parents died unexpectedly. She was treated as a sister by Jennifer and the twins, but she was in fact a far more distant relative. You look so lovely, Catherine. How did you know to make the outfit yourself? From my mother. She made all types of gowns and designed many of her own costumes during her days on the stage. It's strange to think that if the Puritans win, all the playhouses and theaters will be declared sinful and closed, the very ones in which she performed, she sighed. Where the dress is concerned, however, the fabric came from the Carsons. Alice works there, and when Sophia had a new gown made, she let Alice take the extra material, and Alice gave it to me. I worked on it in secret to surprise you. It is absolutely beautiful, he said honestly, although I regret that you could not have been married in an extravagant white gown with orange blossoms in your hair. I care nothing for ceremony, Robert. I couldn't be happier, and Robert thought again how fortunate he was that this beautiful and unusual woman would soon be his wife. Back at Briarwood, Gregory Stevens, the butler, passed through the great hall, and Julian stopped him to ask where Robert had gone. He left at dawn in the company of a young lady, sir. Do you know who? I can't say I could place her, sir, but she did look familiar. A bit taller than average, with an abundance of fair hair. Julian mumbled his thanks, allowing it to cross in and out of his mind that Robert had actually run off with Blake's daughter. Well, if you see Lance or Rook, please tell them I'm looking for them. It appears as if we're having trouble with thieves again, as if the poaching problem wasn't bad enough. Luce told me Reginald has said 4 hens came up missing this morning. I'll deliver your message, sir, Gregory said, and the 2 men went out their separate ways.